So, Cherie, let me give a quick overview for the Memorial Museum, although I'm not a part of them. I was asked by them to do an interview with a few people for two reasons. One, the traumas that had been placed 20 years ago on so many, certainly on first responders from 9/11 up in New York City and throughout the country, and then how we've moved along from that 20-year period into different sections, which I think is the reason that Cherie Castellano, whom I'll introduce slightly here, in terms of what your experiences were, not only from 9/11, but also I think the benefit of this area, the Northeast United States, having you become the first national program for crisis relief for first responders. And certainly you and I go back at least 22 years in our processes of support for first responders. And Cherie, so I'll begin by saying, when we met back in 99, 98, 99, you were just coming off of some work that you were doing with the Newark, New Jersey Police Department.
Right.
And then maybe you can just talk a little bit about how that transitioned into the legislation that opened up the door for you with cop to cop. And then from that, I'll interject a little bit about 9/11, and then we can go from there to the next 2 years, to 5 years, to 10 years, to 20 years, and we can kind of finish up our interview at that point. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay, so why don't you let us know how you started with some of your positions, certainly at the Newark Police Department, and some of the work you were doing there.
Okay. So I think for me, yeah, it was more than 20 years ago. It was in 1998 that, as a licensed clinician in New Jersey, I was really interested in thinking about the impact of trauma. And so I got the opportunity to work in Newark, New Jersey at University Hospital and UMDNJ, the New Jersey Medical School at the time, where Newark was amongst the most violent city in the country. In 1 year, it was the most violent city in the United States of America. And so I found out about a small grant through the Department of Justice to look at the impact of trauma on specialty populations. And having been working in the emergency room and in clinical care in Newark, I knew that after shootings, while the gang violence and the violence escalated, I would see police officers come in to the ER and to centers with people who needed help. And they had this sort of deer in the headlights look. No one ever asked them how they were about the shooting or how they were about the exposure to trauma. It was always someone else. And so I asked, what happens to the cops here? And, the answer was, oh, they don't like mental health professionals. They speak to each other and, get out of here. And who knows, maybe they go have a drink or go back to work. There was no clear answer. So I got really interested in understanding the impact of trauma on law enforcement officers. And like I said, because it was the most violent city in the country, I got a small grant with a psychiatrist and a retired police officer who was a chaplain. And we had pagers at the time. I'm dating myself, but we created this little project based on Dr. Jim Reese's work in the FBI, which was really about understanding using peers and crisis intervention to mitigate long-term post-traumatic stress. So we had a group of rookies in the Wild West district that were out in the streets, police officers that had actually gotten carjacked during that time because the violence was so out of control. The officers that we supported, the rookies that we provided services to, not only reported it really being effective, but their performance was better. So the risk analysis management system that collected data about police officers' performance said they made more arrests, there was less complaints of excessive force, they booked off less. So they actually improved their performance, which was exciting and an unanticipated benefit of that. So at that point, I just knew that, by supporting officers, I sort of looked at it as, if you rescue rescuers, you're helping everybody because they're the ones who help everybody. And it became really key to me to create resources that were confidential and they could use to go out and do their amazing service. And at that time, in the city of Newark, following the grant, the police department and the union picked up this project. And concurrently, our state was, managing a lot of crisis around law enforcement, the allegations of racial profiling, escalated violence in our cities. There was a lot going on, and Governor Whitman at the time created legislation that said that forfeiture funds would be appropriated to create cop to cop. And the legislation said that cop to cop had to be using retired law enforcement officers. We had to hire retired cops for confidentiality and, to really engage them, because they're also at risk for depression and suicide after they leave the job. It was a really smart piece of legislation. It described a need for a peer helpline, crisis intervention, prevention training. And so because of the work I had done in Newark, I got the opportunity to start Cop to Cop in 1999, and we went live with it in 2000.
So Cherie, that program that you started in 99 was within another larger mental health group, the University Behavioral Health Care,
Right.
which was one of New Jersey's larger mental health providers. And just talk just a little bit about some of the things you had to do to create. It certainly wasn't anything they had ever seen before in terms of the specialized field for police officers and peers coming in and all those different types of processes within a big system of mental health.
Yeah. So, I mean, what was so fortuitous was meeting you and being able to have you guide and mentor me in the program development from your expertise and decades of delivering superb law enforcement, psychological services through employee assistance. And really that being a foundation of understanding of how to design the Cop to Cop program as sort of a supplement or an enhancement to employee assistance. But I think that the other thing that was fortuitous, and I always say an answer to a prayer, because I think this work is a ministry as much as a mission and a job, is that Rutgers University Behavioral Health Care, you're correct, did have one of the largest, most effective call centers in the country. A ton of experience at managing crisis calls and care for managed care, for large populations, for the entire state of New Jersey. So what I understood was that although the pilot project in Newark was important, that experience wasn't going to be enough to create a statewide program for 35,000 officers from every kind of agency with every kind of problem 24/7. And so I got the benefit of integrating my experience with the law enforcement peer support and what I thought was the cultural needs into this clinical call center infrastructure with millions of dollars of equipment and licensed mental health professionals and data collection systems. So we really got the best of both worlds because it was an academic behavioral healthcare center and we had this experience with the peers.
And here you are developing all of those pieces. You're maneuvering to make sure that the policies are in order and hiring people and getting the training for those peer members, and 9/11 hits. So
yes, yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, how that kind of changed some direction towards disaster response, not just crisis intervention, one-on-ones and family members calling.
Yeah, I mean, I think since I had learned from you and of course the NYPD, EAS, the guys over at, the New York Police Department had done superb work. And, I was also working with Dr. Reese from his FBI experience and just sort of trying to take in a lot. Dr. Everly, who was one of the creators of the debriefing and the CISM movement. But I got a chance to work with a lot of national experts during that time that I developed the program. But it was a slow start. I'm a new clinician and, married to a police officer, but really, trying to understand the culture and the needs. And there wasn't a lot to go on other than all of you experts that I just mentioned. But I think we did take it slow. We hired what we called cop clinicians. I found retired police officers who were licensed clinicians. And I thought that would be a great start to embody both of those things. And then at that time, recognizing that if I did that as well as, had the infrastructure of the call center, maybe we could slowly build this program into a national model. So 9/11 hit, and gosh, there's so much to say about that. But I think to start, what I think is most important is that because we were the only legislated peer support and crisis intervention program in the United States of America, and we still are, by law, we became part of the disaster mental health plan, which meant that the governor had to then, deploy through the disaster mental health system, a variety of components, and we were one of them. So, I quickly realized that, we were requested to respond to a staging area in Jersey City, of course, along with the state police and other key players that were leaders in the state, to respond to disaster mental health needs and crisis needs. And so we just sort of got off the phones and got in our cars and, rushed down there on that day with this sense of, hoping that we could do something amidst sort of the shock of what was happening. And that was, it was a very, very remarkable and incredible moment.
So let's just talk a little bit about that, because I know you and I were together probably on the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, back in 01 of September. And then you began to pay attention, I think, from a request to the Port Authority Police and the immense amount of trauma that was experienced, certainly within the World Trade Center buildings.
Yeah, I mean, I think, two ththings I want to say, and you were, again, you were such a mentor and guide, and the state police with, our urban search, our New Jersey Task Force 1, and those heroic people just going into action and rescue and recovery. What I remember that's interesting and important for me about that was, partnering with the state police and the other disaster mental health leaders. And although we all were alleged experts, sort of the shock, disbelief, and lack of understanding of what was happening. So trying to prepare, and I remember we wrote on a pizza box, like, something on the back of one that said,
exactly right.
Prices. We literally were so ill prepared because we had never
with duct tape.
Like
I think we used duct tape.
Yeah, we used duct tape. We did. But just, trying to strategize from all of our experience on what to do to prepare for these boats that we thought were coming over, right? With the surgical triage setups and everything we thought was happening with rescue and recovery from ground zero over to the Jersey City side. And, watching the time go by and trying to track the news and understanding what was happening with communication while we were trying to strategize what services we would need. This idea of going from people coming across the river to need medical attention to boats coming over with body bags or just nothing coming at all, and recognizing that the rescue, was not the rescue we thought it was immediately, kept shifting what we thought we were going to do for the first responders and for anybody in crisis, because it was a big difference to try to understand minute by minute, I think, the destruction and the death, and trying to consider designing services for what was really happening, but not knowing what was really happening was very complicated. And so, to speak to your point, I kept getting alerts that, we were charged with not just supporting the New Jersey Task Force 1 and whatever state police told us to do, but the governor's office wanted us to handle the most affected rescuers. And that would mean police, fire, EMS, and anyone dramatically impacted in that moment, which seemed like everyone. But that Port Authority seemed to have the greatest need on that initial day. And so we should focus first on Port Authority and getting to them because of their leadership, their losses, their role on that day of 9/11. So yes, we went from the staging area trying to understand what was happening there and working with you in the pizza box and, figuring out who was on the team and who could handle it. And again, trying to maintain our own emotions, in the midst of all of this for safety. I mean, my husband was a law enforcement officer at the time in Jersey City. He worked for the Hudson County Prosecutor's Office, and there was a lot going on in Jersey City on that day. And so he was working and I was working. I had a 2-year-old, a 6-month-old, and here I was not knowing when I was going home, but also not knowing about his safety and my own safety, but just trying to stay focused on setting up some sort of relief or emergency support.
So Cherie, your experience coming from the Newark police and now becoming what I always would consider as my expert on trauma in law enforcement, that expertise you then were asked by the executives at PAPD, the chiefs, the people that were still, because they had lost so many, to include their director of police, you were then brought in at those meetings to start to establish and create some kind of a response. And maybe you can just talk a little bit about that, how it started and then took you probably, I'm guessing at this, it was at least 3 to 5 years that you had some attention paid towards
7 years.
trauma.
It was 7 years. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, again, there's so much to tell, but for the essence of time, I just wanted to mention also that, I kept having to sort of snap myself out of moments of awe and wonder, besides the grief and the trauma, because there were so many leaders that were missing at that time on that first day in Port Authority, that there were people acting in their roles because they were missing and later identified as lost in that tragedy. And so we were in offices of people who were missing, and we were dealing with people who were in roles that, just had to step up in the middle of all this, again, while they were responsible, for the security and what was going on at that building, and had this tremendous loss of their own, department. It was incredible. But so, yeah, we quickly partnered with the Port Authority police leadership, the employee assistants, the medical unit. There were unions involved. There was a lot of moving parts. There were a lot of well-intended people too, but that kind of made it a little bit trickier, to be honest, because we had to sort of weed out who could really help and who knew what they were doing and who didn't. And we tried to figure that out as quickly as possible. In addition, what we did was just try to create a plan day by day, what is needed for just this moment. And in the midst of all that, I think the night of 9/11, when I first went down to ground zero with the leaders from Port Authority, and then we were with you at Jacob Javits, of course, which we can talk about. But I think the focus was, what is the greatest need, and just trying to ascertain what's the greatest need. And I called Dr. George Everly and I said to him that everything I had done with him in training up until that moment seemed like it wasn't applicable. I sort of in a hysterical way said, I need your help. I need you to get here because, I'm supposed to be an expert from your model, and it's not fitting in this chaos and in this moment, and I don't know how to adapt it, and I need your help. And he said, okay, and got in the car and drove down and met us there. And you were there with part of that. But so went from Port Authority headquarters to ground zero to Jacob Javits to work with you with that superb program that you set up for the New Jersey Task Force One.
So then, Cherie, a statement you had mentioned to me years ago, I don't mean to challenge your memory, but it was something that I'm pretty sure you still recognize with trauma, was something to do with the Oklahoma City bombing, that there was a loss of 168 individuals, and 12 years out, the trauma on the first responders was still felt. And this was a much more massive disaster. And you were preparing for long term because of that. Was it something like that? It was like a study that had been done?
Yes. I think both with Dr. Everly and some of the experience I had in working beside people who had handled that disaster, I think I understood it was a long-term, just like it was a long-term recovery process at ground zero for more than 6 months. This was going to be a long-term crisis intervention process. I didn't anticipate how many years it was going to be, but I kept thinking that I saw other clinicians and interventionists getting overwhelmed about thinking they weren't doing enough. And I kept trying to just say to myself, just do what you need to do today, focus on today so you can get to tomorrow, and then we'll continue to revise, adapt, get more resources. And I think my flexibility, I think all the failures and, my lack of perfectionism really served me well, because I think that, I was really comfortable saying, I don't know what I'm doing. And, even though I'm a trauma expert, I am not an expert in this, and I don't know who is. And so I got Dr. Reese, I got you, I got Dr. Everly. I tried to get people who I knew were smarter than me and who I knew had a lot of experience. But even them, everyone was saying, this is different than anything we've seen. So let's create something. And I really believe that if you listen to the voice of the people you serve in law enforcement or in a disaster, they will tell you what they need. Like, don't guess, don't go by the books, don't make it up. Listen to the voice of who you're serving. And so I kept trying to, without interrupting their recovery or re-traumatizing them, figure out from leadership and then from those on the pile and family member, whoever I could get to, what is it that you need right now in this moment, and design the interventions that way. And that's what we did. And we did that from 9/11 until the day Ground Zero closed. And then following, when Ground Zero closed, we stayed on that project for 7 years, and I have stayed supporting a family now, up until last week. So this doesn't end, but I think, what's important quickly to sort of recap about the interventions and lessons learned for everyone listening about 9/11 was, I think that leadership was traumatized. Obviously, EAP, everyone was traumatized. So asking people what they wanted was a little bit of a slippery slope, because I needed to recognize that they were direct victims or vicarious victims of the event at the same time as they were trying to focus on supporting the officers that they led. And so constantly balancing, providing them support in that moment for their mental health and their grief and shock, as well as offer them choices so that they didn't have to come up with something, but knew these are my options. And this one sounds like the best one for today, and just reviewing that every day. So we created morning and end of day briefs. We created communication systems, whether it was through pagers or, meeting at logistically different places. We established a training about the culture of Port Authority and designed a mutual aid team to be able to pick and choose retired peer officers, licensed clinicians, and people who understood the culture right away. At the same time, we had a 300% increase on the cop to cop line, because Governor DeFrancesco put our number out for all the first responders in New Jersey. There's about 130,000 first responders. So while we were managing what was happening at Port Authority and trying to support what you were doing at, Jacob Javits Center and at Ground Zero, we were also then trying to balance the unique needs of Port Authority. So it was a lot. I mean, we worked 16-hour days like everybody did. But we were inspired by how much those Port Authority officers and everyone, didn't want to get off that pile. If they were on 5 days a week, they volunteered the other 2. It was easy to be inspired to work 7 days a week, right? Because their heroism was just magnificent, and we could always look at the cross at Ground Zero and think about what was going on. So I think during that intervention, lesson learned was collaborate, use existing resources, don't bring new people in unless they're national experts, try to keep out the people who are sort of wounded healers and well-intended, but make it more about them than, about who's in need of service. So we really had to be very restrictive and picky about who we trained. We did training every other day because we felt like we had to keep, adapting training. We generated documents that people could use. And then we set up a system to host debriefings at every location that Port Authority was, for example. So we had people around the clock, we had debriefings at 2 o'clock in the morning at the tunnel, we were in the bus stations, we were wherever the officers were. We tried to get there and do what we could. And again, it always felt like a Band-Aid on an amputation, right? But it was better than nothing. And it was better than some of the other stuff that they were getting that didn't feel like it fit. And And so we just kept trying to collect information and adapt. We used the mental health clinicians at Rutgers to help us answer the calls, that 300% increase on the first responder line. And pretty quickly, we were able to access funds. I mean, I think that's the other thing people don't do when there's a disaster is they don't think about funding. I mean, if you don't think about having money to pay people to actually help people, the volunteerism can go just so far and people get burnt out, you know? So I think we were quickly, you know, considering how to get funding, and the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund was really immediately available through the federal government for 9/11 victims and their families. And so I felt my charge was to explain that first responders were victims, that they were direct victims, they were secondary, tertiary, and if the first responders were victims, they should get the victim funding for unique support that could be designed for them. And we got millions of dollars to do that.
So Cherie, that kind of brings us up to the next 10 years, maybe, or 5 to 10 to 15.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a good point to just talk a little bit about from that established planning that you did and development of the Cop to Cop program, because as you said, I do recall you not just being, you know, at 9/11 and doing stuff for Port Authority, you were also the director of the Cop to Cop call center, which was getting, like you said, calls all the time, which I think the benefit of you doing both did develop your program in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And maybe you can just talk more general about the traumas that continue to go to the suicide calls, to what Cop to Cop and what you've continued to do all the way up until now.
Yeah, I mean, I think some highlights from that time, you know, we recognize that veterans and teachers and firefighters and rescuers, and there were a lot of groups that were a specialty population that were dramatically impacted by 9/11. And so besides, you know, adapting and using the skills and the crisis intervention and peer support counseling and, you know, resilience training and things we could do to support people, grief and trauma response support, we also recognized that all these other groups had needs. So we developed other programs. You know, today, just to fast forward, I'm the director of the National Center for Peer Support at Rutgers that has 17 different peer support programs, and our New Jersey Vet to Vet program that started because of 9/11 and the military's role in 9/11 with the National Guard and all the work that they did became a national model when the military suicide rates increased and were really a pandemic level. Now Vets for Warriors is the national peer support program to deal with suicide and peer support. So it did sort of snowball into all these other operations and all these other projects and all these other opportunities to now create this national center and you know, opportunities to serve so many unique rescuers. However, I do want to mention that I think with 9/11, some of the highlights included collaborating with groups like you know, NYPD, FDNY, all of the other entities, and recognizing that other people have expertise, and we need to all share that expertise in these moments of crisis and not have silos and not compete and work together and learn from each other. And I got to go on a 9/11 delegation tour through Northern Ireland and all over the country, to where I went to Belfast, and we spoke in Belfast, where they had the most terrorist bombings in the hotel. So we actually became a group of leaders post 9/11 with fire, EMS, cops, who went around the country and talked about how to collaborate and how to cope with the impacts of 9/11. So I think there's an obligation to not only collaborate, but also continue to educate and share your message around the world. But I loved one of the things that we did that I just want to mention fast, Jim, which was we understood that there was a core group at 9/11. There were about 600 officers who had worked for 6 months, more than 6 days on the pile. And so we created a crisis management briefing for them. And this is something that I was really excited about that you were involved with. We designed a 3-day intervention where we took data that we had collected from them over those months at Ground Zero, and we created family sessions, educational sessions, physical health, spiritual supports, another round of debriefings, private counseling, medical triage for them, if they had implications from their exposure. And those 3 days and using those national experts, I still have had officers and families contact me and say that seemed to be a life-saving intervention, that, they felt like they went there and they were in their own world with just those who were most affected, with every resource they possibly needed, and the best people in the country as experts training and supporting them. And that actually allowed them to go on, because what we heard a lot following 9/11 was, listen, my husband wasn't killed at 9/11, but he's gone. He's not here. He's here, but he's not here. And so besides the 37 and honoring the 37 that were lost, we had what we thought were hundreds, if not thousands, that were still here, but we're gone.
Yeah.
And, you're never the same, right? No such thing as getting back to normal, but how do we get to that new normal with those people so they can move on and live the lives they deserve to live? So those kinds of things were really important. And we wrote about that, and that was adapted by the military. They used it for yellow ribbon returns. Other people used it around the world. So it was very cool to have the opportunity to learn and develop things and have funding to do it and see it work. And understand that as much as it felt like we did nothing, I guess we did something. And so to fast forward to now, we were able to create helplines for all of the populations that we were serving. So Fire EMS helpline, Port Authority helpline, 9/11 rescuer, vet to vet. So we really thought that it was important, besides being present with people face to face, to have that follow up, to get permission to call them after you leave the scene and talk to them alone, one-on-one, in the privacy of their home, when they have a chance to really think about what's happening, and to stay present with them. We called people for 7 years every week and said, how are you? And it changed, and you need to be present. I think the patriotism and the moments that I'll never forget of driving down the West Side Highway with, the New Jersey Task Force One team, and having people put pictures up to the windows, and knowing after going to the pile that there wasn't a good chance of those people being found, and not speaking about that, but hopeful, and then thinking about so much, how do we support these people who are heroically rescuing and trying to recover and protect us, so that they're not lost. And that's, we still live that today. I think you're right. I think, the manifestation of the funding, creating programs, learning, applying that then to all the deployments and the yellow ribbon events, and supporting the military, continuing to support law enforcement. We did some research studies about the impact of the alerts, right? Because there was a shattered assumption of safety. People no longer felt safe. And that was true for first responders too. But, the media and everyone told us, oh, Cherie, you must be so busy on these hotlines right away. And we weren't, because everybody was still working, like first responders were not reaching out until 2003, unless we were reaching out to them. So just a lot of lessons learned.
So Cherie, today, 20 years later, the traumas in first responder work that still occur daily, would that be a correct statement?
Absolutely.
Daily traumas, you're still there. You're still providing services.
Yes.
Can you talk about some of that, and some of the statistics that you think are helpful for like suicide prevention? Those issues.
Yeah, I think where it's culminated to, Jim, and again, just, the blessing of all this work, as of today, Cop to Cop has had over 100,000 contacts. We've trained over 10,000 officers in the state in QPR to go out and be gatekeepers and do question, persuade, and refer, and be their brother and sisters keepers to stop suicide. We've participated in over 1,500 debriefings. We did about 700 alone at 9/11, and have sort of developed virtual ways to apply that during COVID, and just learned a ton. But I think with all that said, we did understand that we wanted to be able to pay it forward and share information. So we did research about the model that I designed called reciprocal peer support. And it's called reciprocal peer support because everyone says on the cop to cop team and all the other teams, they get back when they give in peer support. There's reciprocity. So since you get back when you give, it's reciprocal peer support, but it's structured. And so how do we really measure what we're doing And C, is it improving the equality of life? Is it not just a Band-Aid? Are we really helping people change their lives? And in 2018, we did research that proved that it did. And we were identified by the American Psychiatric Association as a national best practice in peer support for doing really deep dive program evaluation to understand what works and what doesn't work, so that we could train people to do this and replicate it around the country for the current crisis that law enforcement officers are facing. But I think that, for me, the lessons learned that are profound is that you have to have prevention going on all the time for law enforcement officers. You have to always be building their resilience like the military. And if you do resilience training and prevention training and suicide prevention training, and then you have real interventions, great EAPs like you that are culturally competent in law enforcement, or peer support programs like ours that are trained and professionally supervised and clinically sound, you can provide services to people in times when they're not in crisis and help them to get back to work and do well and overcome things. So then when you have these post-vention crisis responses, right, that's what we call the aftermath of trauma is, peer support post-vention. So there's peer prevention with the training, there's peer intervention with the counseling, and then there's peer post-vention, after something horrific happens. But if you've already done your work, if you've already sort of engaged and done what you can to keep them healthy and strong, and work beside them to support and understand the law enforcement officers you're serving, I think the post-vention gets a lot easier because you're already part of the family, you already understand their everyday stress, and you also understand what they can do and what they can't do. And you have that credibility, the confidentiality, the stigma isn't an issue. And so I think those are all the things that we've learned so that we go into the next disaster. We got called to Hurricane Katrina to help people after, the New Orleans police had suicides. We got, called to do COVID work now that, one of our guys who's a deputy chief is getting an award for his work with the police department in New Jersey that lost an officer to COVID and the whole department got COVID. And so, doing virtual COVID debriefings. So everything is informed by 9/11. Everything goes back to 9/11. All of us who were present, everyone has a 9/11 story, but I think folks, who are listening here, and Jim, those of us who were privileged to be there, it changed us forever, right? And I think it changed our work forever for the better. I think, is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Cherie, because I know your wide range, your global, your actual global look on issues, maybe a little bit about family, because you certainly cop to cop, even though it's called cop to cop, I'm pretty sure you get your fair share of calls from family members of first responders or of police officers. And you being a family member of a law enforcement person, maybe you can talk a little bit about that and that support that's needed.
I so appreciate you saying that. It was beautiful following 9/11 to see the police wives and children bring their husbands and wives back to life. I think faith, we understand with post-traumatic growth, right? What does the research tell us? That a sense of yourself, spirituality, and a strong family allows two people to run into that building. One comes out and becomes the chief. The other one might die from alcoholism and trauma. And what is the variables? It's that, that strength, that family strength, that self-awareness, that spirituality. So I think for me, 9/11 made me believe in God more. It made me, love my husband more. We still do something. We're coming up on our 25-year anniversary, but during 9/11, we didn't know if either one of us was alive. And I'm not trying to be dramatic, at different points. And so we decided, because we were both so busy during that time, that we would page the day of our wedding anniversary to each other, 11/16/96. And that would mean that I'm alive and I love you. And again, no cell phones. So we paged that 11/16/96 as the 11th page, and we celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary next week. And we still do the 9/11, 11/16/96 page, as a reminder of not only what's important, but how much we love each other. And I think that's the future of law enforcement resilience and wellness. As a police officer's wife, there isn't enough for law enforcement families, and we're not integrated and trained and supported and part of what happens when we really are. So, you
Yeah.
know, when an officer comes home and is involved in a critical incident and doesn't talk, they think they're protecting us by not telling us about their pain or their suffering. But, you know, we're just guessing. Our imaginations are worse than anything else, and we just feel isolated and helpless. So we didn't do enough family work, and we still don't do enough family work in Cop to Cop, although we do some. And I wrote a book and am very interested in it, but there isn't enough services for law enforcement families. And we need to build that up, just like we're building up their resilience. And that'll be sort of my legacy, hopefully before I leave, to try to build some of that work up.
Cherie, that probably is the perfect place to end our interview here, because I think you did the full circle, and I think it's so important, as I mentioned yesterday to the panel that's going to be presenting, that you're on next week, that a lot of this does go back to 9/11, where not only from the emotional side and the phenomena of that disaster, but all of the positives that we built from, and all of the development of programs that really did come from that. I had mentioned, as you and I have talked many a times, that PTSD has been around for 1,000 years. We just didn't start putting it in the book until after the Vietnam War, which isn't that long ago. And now, after some other disasters that have occurred, and I mentioned what George and Jeff being down in Chase, Maryland, where they really started looking at that critical incident and what the need for the stresses that come from that, and the traumas that can be long-term. And the real need is having someone there, having someone to talk to.
Yes. And
Certainly.
you know, my favorite quote, although the world is full of suffering, it's also full of the overcoming of it. And, you know, I think more than any time in any moment of any of our lives, you know, we witnessed law enforcement officers, you know, overcome suffering and rise and inspire. And, you know, we had counselors at Cop to Cop who have passed away since then, people who got sick. I know you too. So those of us who work together there, we have bonds that last forever. But we can never express the gratitude, right? And so on 9/11 every year, I used to go visit with a family of a heroic Port Authority officer. I have to give a shout out to Officer Tom Gorman. His dad was a miraculous force in my life. I fell in love with that entire family, and Teresa Creedon is going to, I think, speak as part of this, and she is another hero of mine. But getting to, you know, really know a family and live with a family who then subsequently lost another son to the illness related to his exposure at 9/11, and just watching what people do to move forward, and you know, how they continue to live the legacy and you know, keep the heroism alive. I have my moments where I'm really mad about the way the community and the world is reacting to law enforcement officers right now, and it's those moments that I want to hold up families like the Gorman family and just scream at the top of my lungs. But you know, I understand it's ignorance. You know, it's really ignorance and the media that have people not understanding who our law enforcement heroes are today. But, you know, it's a blessing to get to talk to you and to get to talk about this, because I also cherish my every year 9/11 text that are from you, the trauma and the bonds that we formed working beside each other, and knowing that all of this I could do because of you, Jim Nestor, as a mentor. It's going to make me cry, but, you know, I'm forever grateful, and we're forever connected, right?
And Cherie, you know, and again, it sounds like we're just kind of going back and forth on each other's respect for each other, but I've been doing this law enforcement stuff for over 45 years. And there's no one in my world that I know, with all my expertise and all my networking in the world, that I think has done more in direct support for first responders and their families than you. So I thank you, as always, for everything you do. And I'm sure that the Memorial Museum is also grateful for everything that you've done and continue to do with this. And I'm looking forward to also having you involved again next Thursday.